What if death didn't just end your life, but thrust you into a world where the line between the living and the dead was forever blurred? Meet Jack Holloway, a man who thought he had escaped death, only to discover it wasn't done with him yet. And what he witnessed in the afterlife changed everything. Jack Holloway was always a man who prided himself on his resilience. At 41, he had weathered his fair share of storms. Broken relationships, financial struggles, and the constant battle with his own demons. But none of that had prepared him for the moment that would change everything. It was a cold, dreary Thursday afternoon when it happened. Jack had been driving home from work, his mind clouded with the usual stress of life. His car's tires squealed as he turned a corner too quickly, the road slick with rain. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. His hands gripping the wheel, the sharp sound of tires skidding, and then, impact. The explosion of sound as the car hit the guardrail, the blinding flash of metal crumpling, glass shattering. Pain exploded through his chest. His vision blurred, his breath stopped. And then, there was nothing. Absolute silence. For a moment, Jack had no idea where he was. No pain, no sensation, just a void that stretched out endlessly. His thoughts were disconnected, floating in a sea of confusion. He could feel his mind trying to cling to something, anything, trying to make sense of it all. And then he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Jack. His name, echoed by a voice that seemed to come from all directions. A voice that sounded like it was both near and far, too familiar and too distant at the same time. Jack. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to him. And then the darkness before him began to shift. A flicker of light, distant, like a pinprick at the end of a long tunnel. He felt himself being drawn toward it, pulled forward against his will, as if the very fabric of reality was bending. He couldn't control it, couldn't fight it. The light was growing closer, blindingly bright, but just before he reached it, the world around him exploded into chaos. The bright light shattered like glass, and Jack found himself standing in a place he couldn't begin to comprehend. It was an ancient, crumbling hallway, lined with thick stone walls. The air was thick with a sense of oppression, heavy and choking. The temperature was freezing, yet he could feel sweat gathering on his brow. But what was worse than the cold was the silence. The oppressive silence that hung around him like something waiting. Jack looked around, his heart racing. No windows, no doors, just endless stone and shadows that stretched on forever. As he moved forward, he heard it, the sound of distant footsteps, echoing from the far corners of the hallway. They weren't human footsteps, though. They were slow, dragging, unnatural. "Who's there?" Jack's voice cracked, but it was drowned by the overwhelming silence. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. It was tall, too tall. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but Jack could feel it staring at him, its presence suffocating. The figure was cloaked in tattered robes, the edges moving like wisps of smoke. The air around it shimmered, warping the world in a way that made Jack's stomach turn. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound confident. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, and with each movement, the shadows seemed to swallow more of the space around them. The figure raised its hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and pointed at Jack. Without warning, the air shifted, growing colder still. Jack gasped as the world around him changed once more. He was no longer in the hallway. He was standing at the edge of a vast abyss. Before him stretched an endless chasm of darkness, a void so deep and suffocating that it made him dizzy just looking at it. He could see shapes moving at the edge of the void, figures floating like lost souls, their eyes vacant and empty. "No," Jack whispered, stepping back, his heart hammering. This isn't real." The figure stepped closer, its presence sending a chill down his spine. "It's real," it whispered, "and you've crossed over." Jack turned, searching for an escape, but the hallway had vanished. All that remained was the abyss and the creatures that drifted within it. He felt his heart race, his breath growing shallow. He could hear whispers now, voices that spoke in tongues he couldn't understand. The figures in the abyss began to move closer, their empty eyes locked on him. One of them, a woman, her face pale and twisted in agony, reached out to him. Her fingers brushed his skin, and a wave of cold shot through his body. Jack staggered backward, unable to move, as the cold spread through him like poison. "No!" he cried, but his voice was drowned out by the growing noise around him. the whispers growing louder, the figures inching closer. "This is not where you belong," the figure said again. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a truth that Jack could feel in his very bones. Before Jack could speak, the figure raised its hand again and the abyss beneath him cracked open. He fell, slowly at first, and then faster, faster until the ground was a blur beneath him. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. He tried to fight it, to reach for something, anything, but there was nothing to grab onto. The void swallowed him whole. Jack's eyes snapped open. He was lying in a hospital bed, the beeping of machines surrounding him. His body felt sore, every muscle aching. He tried to move, but his limbs felt numb. And yet, the feeling of coldness lingered in his chest, like a memory he couldn't shake. The hospital room was sterile, too bright, too clean. But the darkness, the abyss, it hadn't gone anywhere. Jack stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the shadows pressing down on him. Had it all been a nightmare, or had he truly crossed over? One thing was certain, whatever that place was, it wasn't done with him yet, and it would come for him again.